Wir kommen zum dritten Block des heutigen Tages. Veränderungen im politischen Machtgefüge und ihre Konsequenzen für die Welt. Geopolitische Risiken sind das große Thema unserer Zeit. Weltweite Krisenherde beeinflussen die Märkte wie seit dem Kalten Krieg nicht mehr. Wir haben in den Vorträgen des heutigen Tages, ob es bei den Volkswirten war, bei Herrn Verrode und auch am Nachmittag beim Herrn Simonis, schon viel über aktuelle Krisen und Krisenherde gehört. Mit dem nächsten Vortrag möchten wir Ihnen einen Gesamtblick geben, einen absoluten Experten aus dem Bereich der Politik, der sich wahrscheinlich wie kaum ein anderer mit der geopolitischen Lage auseinandergesetzt hat. Thomas Donilon ist einer der erfahrensten und bestvernetztesten Politiker in den USA. Er war seit 1977 für 3 amerikanische Präsidenten tätig. Von 2010 bis 2013 war er der erste Sicherheitsberater von Präsident Barack Obama. In seinen Aufgabenbereich fiel die Koordination der Nachrichtendienste, der Verteidigung und der Informationsdienste. Das heißt, er war an erster Stelle, wenn es um Informationen zu weltweiten Entwicklungen ging. Er ist darüber hinaus Senior Director im BlackRock Investment Institute. Ich darf ihn jetzt auf die Bühne bitten, Mr. Donilon. Es freut mich sehr, dass Sie heute hier sind. Yes, please enter the stage. Sorry. Right. Thank you very much.
Okay.
It's your turn. Your
Thank you
presentation.
very much, Andrews. Thank you very much. I don't speak German, so I'll just assume what you said was positive and take the stage here. So it's great to be here today with all of you, and to be here in Frankfurt today especially, and to be at this 19th, I guess, Johan, 19th anniversary event of this gathering. I'm here on behalf of the BlackRock Investment Institute, and at BlackRock we're charged with integrating full assessments of portfolio and investment thesis. We try to provide, and I think we do provide, the highest quality intellectual capital we can to the investing community. My role, since coming to BlackRock from the government, has been to advise on geopolitical trends and risks for BlackRock. As noted, I was the President's National Security Advisor for nearly 5 years in the White House with Barack Obama. President Obama is the 3rd president that I've served with. Since starting in 1977 with Jimmy Carter. I had a lot more hair then, and it was a lot thinner many years ago, but again, 3 presidents. The position of National Security Advisor in the United States government is a unique position. It was established really in full with President Kennedy. We had a fully empowered National Security Advisor, and there's 3 or 4 roles that person plays. One, as was said, is to coordinate U.S. military, diplomatic, and intelligence efforts in the U.S. government. Second is to chair what's called our Principals Committee, our Cabinet Committee that advises the President. So during my time in the first term of Obama, my committee would have been myself and then Vice President Biden, Hillary Clinton, Bob Gates, Leon Panetta, Dave Petraeus, and the late Richard Holbrooke, who's well known in Germany, obviously. It was not a shy and retiring group, as you could tell by the names, but really proud to be associated with them. And the third role was to provide the President's daily briefing each day. The President's daily briefing was the first meeting that he had every morning. And again, that it was institutionalized in the United States government starting in 1961, when President Kennedy decided that he wanted to meet every day with his intelligence advisors and to find out what was going on. What was the most important information? What was the hottest information that was going on in the world at that point where he could discuss it? I gave those briefings, that briefing 855 mornings. And thinking about today, and given the number of things that are going on in the world, I'm going to try to do this in the style of what I would do if the President asked me this morning, if I were in my old job, of what are the most important general trends you see in the world today. So that's what I'll do. I'll try to review a number of the key trends that I see in the world. I'm going to break it down because I've also detected a lot of interest in some events like Brexit and the U.S. elections. I'll break it down into discussing 4 trends and then 2 events. And we'll see if we can do that in the allotted time. I'd like to leave plenty of time for questions and answers. Because I will bore myself for 60 minutes if I have to talk up here. So I really do encourage your questions and discussion. Let me make a general observation about the world today. As a general matter, I think the world today is characterized by an unusually large number of volatile and unstable situations. It's a level of volatility and instability that we've only seen twice since World War II. John Brennan, who's the U.S. CIA director, gave a speech on this topic in Washington at the end of last year and said that the CIA saw more outbreaks of instability and volatility than any time since the collapse of the Soviet Union, where there was volatility, obviously, matching the rate that we saw in the 1960s during the period of decolonialization globally. It's not just been a period of protest and government change, but also violent insurgencies and a breakdown in the ability of governments to govern. So if the world seemed especially or unusually volatile and unstable to you on a daily basis, that is because quantitatively it is. As compared to any time since, only twice since World War II. In my judgment, this level of volatility and instability is rooted in four key trends, which I'd like to discuss. The first trend is the broad and continuing breakdown of and systematic breakdown of state authority in the Arab Middle East, especially since the start of the Arab revolutions of the so-called Arab Spring in January of 2011. We don't call it the Arab Spring much anymore because almost all the impacts of the Arab revolutions have been negative. Negative for security in the United States and in Europe, and frankly negative for the peoples of the Arab world. And there's no end in sight, which I'll talk about in a second. Essentially, we're seeing the collapse of the post-World War I state system put together by the Europeans in the wake of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire, which had controlled the goings-on in the Middle East for 400 years, broke down after World War I, and the Europeans' powers put in place these Arab state systems. And we're seeing the breakdown. And indeed, the breakdown today has resulted in a number of out-and-out failed states, from Libya to Yemen to Syria to portions of Iraq. I define failed state, by the way, in a specific way. That is the inability of the government to control what goes on inside its borders, to control the groups that operate in the borders, to lose a monopoly on the use of force. And I think we've seen that throughout the Middle East, again, out and out in at least four countries. And indeed, I think you've seen it in part in a number of countries ranging all the way from Libya to Afghanistan. So we have a large swath of humanity, a large swath of the world, where governments don't control what goes on inside their borders totally. And this, I think, is the breakdown, the systemic breakdown I think we've seen in the Middle East. The result is vast ungoverned spaces where groups like ISIS and others can take root and operate. This vacuum that's been created by this failure of governance really does provide, again, as I said, the sanctuary, if you will, the ability, the place for groups like ISIS to take root. You know, you can try to light on to your own historical analogies in thinking about this. My own is the 30 Years' War in Europe. I think it is in some ways quite comparable because you have multiple layers of conflict. You have uprisings against states, insurgencies, right? That's what you have in Iraq and in Syria and elsewhere, in Libya. You have sectarian conflicts now within states. So in Syria, it starts off with an insurgency against the Assad regime, and it migrates over to Sunni and Shia groups fighting against each other in kind of more of a sectarian conflict. You have a region-wide conflict that ISIS is undertaking, which is to create a caliphate, restore a caliphate in Iraq and Syria across borders. And you have, very importantly, a proxy war underway between Shia and Sunni, led by Saudi Arabia on the Sunni side and Iran on the Shia side. And this is a very big part of what's going on in the Middle East today. The causes of this are manifold. I would cite three, though. One is a total failure of governance among the Arab states for decades, a failure to deliver legitimate, accountable, and effective government for their people. The second was the invasion of Iraq. This had an incredibly disruptive effect in the Middle East, and it unleashed a lot of these furies of sectarian conflict. And the third isn't talked about very much, but I think it had a lot to do with this. Dr. Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was one of my predecessors in the White House, he worked for President Carter, calls this the Great Political Awakening. I think it's the communications revolution. So you had within these countries you had the ability now, through communication systems, to organize against the government in ways that you didn't have before, that you can get around the police state. That's what happened in Egypt, for example. And you can no longer convince these populations that things are going great for you. You know, we've got a great regime here. You know, things couldn't be better in our country, because they know that's not true. Because of the communications revolution brought about by technology that we have seen globally. And I think this is a broader global trend, which we can talk about, this great political awakening. Dr. Brzezinski, I have a quote here from him, said, "For the first time in history, almost all of humanity is politically activated, conscious, and politically interactive," which I think is what we saw in the Middle East and throughout the world. So if you look at this situation and you're in a U.S. or a European policymaker, you might say, well, that's just going to have to run its course. And why don't we just back off? There's not a lot of economic interest that we have there other than oil. And there's not a lot of economic activity. There's not a lot of investment opportunity. So why don't we just try to pull back? The problem, and this, by the way, was a substantial instinct in the U.S. government for a number of years, right? Particularly in the wake of the Iraq War. And you can understand why. And there was a reluctance in the U.S. government to get involved in another military conflict in the Middle East. The problem is that they now have gotten to a point where there are external impacts. And they impact us in Europe and in the United States. And what are they? Migration, number one, obviously. Last year, there were between 1 million, these numbers are hard to get your hands around, but between 1 million and 1.5 million migrants in the year 2015 from all over, by the way, from Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and of course, we've seen, especially in the last few weeks, you've seen very graphically from sub-Saharan Africa coming up through Libya, because you've had a breakdown in the state system in Libya. No government in Libya, no ability to stop the traffickers who traffic in these poor souls, right? You know, and do so with impunity. And you have 700 people die in 3 boating accidents in the Mediterranean a couple of weeks ago. So you have a migration pressure. Now, some of that has been reduced a bit by the arrangement that Chancellor Merkel entered into with then Prime Minister Davutoglu in Turkey. That's fraying a bit, but the fact is it has reduced the number of migrants coming from the Middle East, at least for now. The second external impact is terrorism. We saw that obviously in Brussels and in Paris. ISIS is a group that is as I said, it's an insurgent group, it's a terrorist group, it's also a proto-state. It's an unusual group because it is well-financed, has been well-financed. It's got large numbers. Some 35,000 foreign fighters have gone into ISIS, 5,000 of them from Europe. You saw 7 of the 8 Paris attackers had gone back and forth to Syria like they were on holiday, which is a big failure in the European system, by the way. So the terrorist threat, I think, persists. My own judgment is that Europe has a long way to go in terms of enhancing its ability to control its borders, share information and intelligence among its states, and to devote a lot more resources to this, because this threat is not going away. Indeed, I think the threat in Europe right now is as high as it's been since 9/11. Third, you have energy interests, obviously, in the Middle East. And fourth, you have obviously proliferation risk, which is why we work so hard on the Iran nuclear deal. So walking away is not an option, I think, in the Middle East. Outlook. I think that these conflicts will extend really for, this could be a generational fight. I do think we're making good progress against ISIS, frankly, though. It's being shrunk. As they get shrunk, they'll push out externally, which is why you have attacks like we had in Paris and in Brussels. Over time, I think this phenomenon can be defeated, but it's a long-haul effort, certainly well beyond the Obama years. Before I leave the Middle East and go to the second trend, I wanted to say a word about Saudi Arabia. There are extraordinary events underway in Saudi Arabia right now, for those of you who are looking at Saudi Arabia from an investment perspective and who look at oil policy and economics. There's been a series of factors that have pressured in on Saudi Arabia and have come together at the same time, which have caused them to take some extraordinary steps. What are those factors? Persistent low oil prices, obviously since the beginning of 2014, through the Saudi Arabian decision and the OPEC decision in November 14 not to decrease production in order to prop up prices, but to rather let the market play out. Demographic pressure in Saudi Arabia. We have a large number of youth coming up who need jobs. Pressure from Iran. If you sit in Riyadh right now, I've been in Riyadh 4 times in the last 12 or 15 months. If you sit in Riyadh and you look out and you're thinking about Iran as your principal competitor in the region, you see Iran in Yemen, you see Iran in Syria, you see Iran in Iraq, you see Iran in Lebanon. And you feel under pressure, and there's a real proxy effort for influence there. You also have succession issues. The most important person right now in Saudi Arabia, really the de facto person running the economy, and also the defense minister, is a 30-year-old son of the king, Mohammed bin Salman. The deputy crown prince, technically third down or second in line to the crown, but nonetheless the de facto ruler, in my view, at this point in Saudi Arabia. So you have succession issues. So they've put out, in the last few weeks, really some extraordinary documents and plans. They put out a Saudi Plan 2030, which calls for Saudi Arabia to move away from its dependence on oil and actually to IPO 5% of Saudi Aramco going forward here. Just this morning, they put out a national transformation plan, which is the details underneath this plan. Very aspirational. Saudi, obviously, and looking at business opportunities, trying to move away from dependence on oil and trying to develop a kind of a non-oil economy. At the same time, they will go through these succession issues. And you very well could have, in Saudi Arabia, a 30-something-year-old king of Saudi Arabia, which would be an extraordinary event, who is really trying to commit to kind of moving Saudi Arabia forward, not just economically, but also socially. It's all in the execution. Saudi Arabia is a very conservative place. These reforms are difficult, but nonetheless, kind of extraordinary events underway there. I think pressured by the things I talked about, including oil, which has put real fiscal pressure on Saudi Arabia, even Saudi Arabia that had $750 billion in reserves. Second big trend, the reemergence of great power competition. For 25 years, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the great powers, Europe, China, the United States, really engaged in productive and constructive relations. Indeed, the big project of the United States and Europe was to bring its former adversary, the Soviet Union and then Russia, into the economic and political institutions of the West. Integration was what it was all about going forward. And this effort I think, made a tremendous amount of progress. That period, in my view, came to an end with Vladimir Putin coming back to the presidency in 2012 in Russia. He had a different view as to Russia's role in the world, the unique role it wanted to play, his view on what had happened to Russia since the fall of the Soviet Union. I went to, I can pause in a second here. I went to see Putin the Friday night before he was inaugurated. Because we didn't have a direct relationship with him. It was a structural issue. You know, the President of the United States met with the elected President of Russia, who before Putin was Dmitry Medvedev. And so you really can't go to a country and say, we're here to have a summit. We're going to meet with you, Mr. President, but let's keep this meeting short because we really want to meet with the guy in charge. It doesn't work that way, right? You know, so we had not had a lot of interaction with Putin, frankly. So after he came back to the presidency, I have to say after he was reelected, because it was essentially he had dinner with Medvedev and decided he was going to be president again. So went to see him, and it was even clear then that he was going to take Russia in a different direction. A real sense of grievance that you could feel. I think he was driven in most part by his own domestic political concerns, felt pressured given some of the economic. Remember, the Russian economy was in trouble before sanctions and Ukraine and Crimea. Pressure on him domestically, and was going to act on this, and a sense that Russia needed to reassert itself in a nationalist way, bring back nationalist pride to the country, and to play a role in some of these events around the world. These concepts it became clear to me then, these concepts of balance of power, spheres of influence, zero-sum outcomes, which seem kind of anachronistic in the 21st century, are very real to Vladimir Putin. And we've seen that, obviously, in the way he's acted since then, with the annexation of Crimea and the invasion of eastern Ukraine. The outlook, I think, is for there to be kind of continued tension between the West and Putin. And I say Putin, by the way, let me pause on that too, as opposed to Russia. It's an autocratic system right now. You know, I dealt a lot with the Chinese leadership, for example. I dealt a lot with the Russian leadership. The Russian decision-making process on national security, I don't know enough about domestic politics in Russia, but on national security, decisions are made by one person. Vladimir Putin. It really is an autocracy with respect. So it is Putin that you're dealing with in Russia. The Chinese system's different, although, and I'll talk about this in a second, although Xi is the most powerful leader of China since Mao, that's true, it's still a system that you have to deal with. There are stakeholders, right? He has to work his way through stakeholders, and they staff out decisions, and they get recommendations. That's not the way this works in Russia, right? The decision to invade Crimea when Putin came back from the Sochi Olympics was made by him and a couple of former FSB guys, right? Who decides that's what they were going to do. So it's actively hostile right now along a number of dimensions. We have been able to compartmentalize some areas, which we have to do, where we can work together, for example, on the Iranian nuclear deal. I hope we can do that on Syria going forward. The economic outlook for Russia, I think, is an extended period of bad news. The economy shrank in 2015 3.7%. I think the current OECD estimate or prediction for 2016 is continued contraction, continued recession of about 2% going forward. I don't see Russia making the kinds of structural changes that are going to allow it to take advantage of some of the pricings and things like that they could take advantage of. Nonetheless, I think we're in for a continued period of tension, if you will. And the problem with that, I worry about two things, and I'll finish on Russia. It's much more difficult to get things done in the world when you don't have the cooperation of one of the major powers. If you have cooperation among the major powers in the world, you can get a lot done in the world. And if you don't, as we've seen in Syria, things go off the rails, and you can have people who are spoilers, and that's what we have, I think, in Russia right now. Third trend. China. And specifically, there's a lot we could say about China, but specifically I think I'm noting here the global adjustment to the Chinese economic and political transition. As I said, Xi is the most powerful leader in China since Mao. He has accumulated vast amounts of authority within his personal office in Beijing. Has done so quite purposefully, I think, for two goals. One, to move his reform agenda forward. Second is to consolidate the power of the party. That's the most important priority for Xi Jinping. Indeed, if Xi were sitting with your hand is right now and we were able to have a little thought bubble above his head and read it, it would say, I'm not going to be Gorbachev. I'm going to move forward on economic reform, but I am not going to undermine the party here. It's a principal thing. So he's undertaking, the scale of what the Chinese are undertaking is unbelievable, right? They are trying to transform this massive economy, right? From an investment export-driven economy to a domestic consumption economy, and trying to do that while maintaining stability, and at the same time, as I said, do this while maintaining party primacy. Nobody has ever been able to pull this off. We'll see if they can. I think outlooks are one, a slower Chinese economy, really, as far as the eye can see. Indeed, on May 9th, on the cover of the People's Daily, which is the way the Chinese communicate these things, a third of the page was given, and in a full page inside, a third of the page was given to a quote-unquote authoritative economic figure, right, who then laid out the Chinese economic plan, right, or the outlook, and he called for an L-shaped recovery. That is a recovery that's going to go down, it has gone down, and will extend like this, flat, for a period of time. The knock-on effects of that are clear, and we've seen it around the world, particularly with commodity economies who have been really hit hard by this. Second, on reform, I think you'll see the Chinese leadership continue to press on reform, but it'll be slow. Because when reform runs into party priorities and stability, the party priorities and stabilities will win out every time, right? And so it'll be kind of a process of grinding away. Third, I think that business will have an increasingly difficult time. I know Germany obviously has deep business ties with China. I think an increasingly difficult time in China for two reasons. Number one, as China goes up the value chain, right, it will be tempted to protect its own indigenous industries and have national champions and make it more difficult for it to be challenged by external companies. The second, and this is important, is the Chinese security services are increasingly involved in commerce. This is especially in the tech world, right, where they are demanding source codes, right, where they go in, for example, Apple, that's had a huge business in China, found out that, iMovies, right, some of its content has been barred, right, the New York Times and the Bloomberg websites are not accessible in China. So you see the security services, this tight control kind of overriding some of the commerce sides. And fourth, on geopolitics, I think the geopolitical situation is actually fairly stable between the United States and China. But there are a couple of flashpoints. The South China Sea, where China claims a big swath of territory and islands and reconstructed islands. And the United States contends, I think correctly, that we have to protect freedom of navigation there, and you can't have these kind of unilaterally demanded acquisitions. I think you'll see continued tension there. And my vote for the biggest crisis of the first year of the next president will be North Korea. North Korea, it's not on the front page of the newspaper every day. And again, obviously, Frankfurt's a long way from North Korea. But in the United States, North Korea developing an intercontinental ballistic missile with a miniaturized nuclear weapon that can hit the continental United States will not be accepted by a U.S. president, and thinks that something will have to happen to address that. Fourth trend, and then I'll go to the events, is the geopolitical impact of sustained low oil prices. There's a supply shock, obviously, in 2014, 2015, that was propelled principally by the shale explosion in production in the United States. It's a fascinating story. It's principally a technology story and a legal rights story and a capital development and small business story in the United States. Nonetheless, it was a dramatic increase in oil production on the world stage and caused, in conjunction with the OPEC decisions not to reduce production, a sustained low set of oil prices, which have recovered a bit now, but not anywhere near where they were in 2014, 2013. The geopolitical impacts have been, the best way that I find to think about this is by country and by category. So you got one set of countries that are really dependent on oil production for their revenues, right, but don't have big reserves. And these are countries like Venezuela and Nigeria and Iraq, and they are in trouble as a result. Nigeria, Venezuela especially, I am really worried about Iraq. They have pressure from ISIS. 80% of the government of the GDP there is essentially government-driven, right? And that's driven in turn by oil. The next are the large oil-producing countries who are dependent on oil but have large reserves, like the Gulf countries. Kuwait, UAE, Qatar are small enough, and I think they've managed it quite well, frankly, reducing subsidies, dealing with their budget. Saudi Arabia is a much bigger challenge, as we talked about earlier, and essentially, this has driven a fundamental rethink of the Saudi economy going forward. They've had to support their budget by reducing their reserves. They want to stop that reduction in reserves, and they want to move on, as I said, to diversify. This plan they have to IPO 5% of Saudi Aramco is a plan to create the largest sovereign wealth fund in the world. They want to create a $2 trillion sovereign wealth fund that can invest around the world. The first investment of that new fund, the Public Investment Fund, which essentially was a small fund in Saudi up until recently, that invested principally domestically. The first investment, $3.5 billion in Uber, and they took a board seat. That's the largest investment in a private company ever. So they're moving out already. The third category of countries are importing countries: Europe, Northeast Asia, India. Where this has been, oil prices have been a big boost have been an important a boost to the economies of our countries. And fourth category is the United States, which is complicated because it's a mix, right? We're both a very large producing country and a very large consuming country. Net, it's a plus for the United States. Although we've lost tens of thousands of jobs in the oil industry, and it's had some obviously depressing effect. That's still a small part of the U.S. economy when you compare it to the vast, broad impact you have of lower oil prices and gas prices. Two events, Brexit and then the elections, and I'll take questions if it's okay. Two events. So Brexit. Two events that I think are contributing to kind of a feeling of instability and volatility in the world. The prediction markets right now have Brexit at between a 1 in 4 and a 1 in 3 chance of passing. The traditional polls have it at like a 50-50 proposition at this point. I think the prediction markets understate the risk, frankly. I do think this reflects kind of a general populist trend in the Western democracies, which we can talk about. I don't know of a single analysis, maybe somebody in the room does, that says that anything but a negative economic impact is going to result from a Brexit, from the IMF to the Treasury, to the Bank of England, to every investment bank that I know. Indeed, just this past week, Lael Brainerd, who's a governor on the Fed in the United States, said that in her judgment, she thought Brexit, because of the potential increase in risk premia, could have a negative impact on the U.S. economy and was a reason not to go ahead on interest rates at the June meeting. And at a minimum, if it passed, there's obviously a lot of predictions. I think most of them seem sensible to me. A 10% reduction in the value of the sterling, a comparable reduction in the stock market, and at a minimum, an extended period of uncertainty between over the next couple of years, really, as Britain tries to figure out a new relationship with Europe. My worries on this are broader, though. My worries on this, are what I worry about, are the geopolitics, right? This could not come at a worse time, I don't think, for Europe. Europe has now, over the last few years, been through a cascade of crises, right? Starting with the recession, the Eurozone, migration, Putin, terrorism, populism, right-wing parties, and all of these have been, the centrifugal forces have been moving towards fragmentation of Europe, right? And pushing negatively on the ability of the European Union to deal with these problems that all require collective action. So I worry that a Brexit could exacerbate these centrifugal forces. I worry that it could add to the sense of fragmentation. It will put pressure on the cohesiveness and functioning of the EU. I think it'll put pressure on the cohesiveness of the UK and Scotland as well. Polls now show that in a half a dozen countries, if the Brexit passes in the United Kingdom, that they would like populations would like to see referendums in their countries. So I think it really is. It's worrying me about the future of a unified and effective Europe. From a selfish U.S. perspective, the United States has spent over half a century working on the belief that a unified, well-functioning Europe was in its interest, and we really could see real damage to this. This, by the way, is, again, now speaking as a hard power national security person, this is great news in Moscow. I think I think that Putin would be would be very much in favor, obviously, of seeing these centrifugal forces, these forces of fragmentation take place in Europe. Last, the U.S. election. Before I became deeply involved in foreign policy, I was deeply involved in American politics and involved in every presidential campaign since 1980 and have prepared every Democratic candidate for the general election debates that we have in the U.S. Every candidate since 1984 through 2008 when I prepared President Obama, then Senator Obama, for his debates against Senator McCain, and then I went into the government. 2,000 of those elections, a lot of elections, of those elections, 2016 is the most unusual and the most consequential, I think, given a number of things. The policy polarization in the United States, the vast differences between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump presidencies that we can talk about in a second here. It's again, I think one of the most consequential elections that the United States has had in its modern times. Trump will be the nominee of the Republican Party, and Hillary Clinton, as of last night, it was announced that she has enough delegates in order to be the Democratic candidate. So Hillary Clinton will be the first woman candidate for a major party in the United States. And she'll go further over the top today after the primaries. I think at this point, Hillary Clinton has an edge in most of the polls that we see in the United States. I think she has a structural edge as well. The Electoral College in the United States, I think we've had a history in the last few elections of these states leaning Democratic. She's, I think, on the right side of the emerging electorate, the demographic electorate in the United States. Hispanics, African Americans, young people, college educated. There's a huge increase in educational attainment in the United States over the last 30 years. In 1980, I think 30% of the electorate did not have any college. Right, it's half that now, right? So there's a big change, and it's moving in the United States with respect to the electorate, and it's moving in terms of its makeup, right? Which is one of the things I think that lots of people who support Trump are concerned about, right? In 1980, 88% of the electorate was white when Ronald Reagan was elected. This time around, it'll be less than 70%. That's a 20% change in the makeup of the electorate from 1980 till today. That's a huge change, and that's, I think, part of what's going on. She also has benefited by the fact that President Obama's approval rating is above 50%. She gets helped by positive views of President Obama. I will tell you, I haven't talked to him about this recently, I think that President Obama will participate in this campaign very aggressively because he has a lot on the line here in terms of his legacy going forward. The economy is okay. in the United States moving forward. There are headwinds for Hillary Clinton. The most important one is that in the United States, it's hard to get a third term for one party. You know, there's an instinct to change in the United States, and she has to push back against that. It's an anti-incumbent year. 2/3 of the country, despite the fact we've had a really good macroeconomic recovery, still believes that the country's not going in the right direction. I'll talk about that in a second. She's been in public life 25 years, and she has negative ratings to show for that. You know, we're getting a lot of controversies over time. But the only person, it's an outsider year, the only person, though, with higher negative ratings and more narrow appeal than Hillary Clinton is Donald Trump, who is an extraordinary candidate. But I'm trying to be as analytical about this as I can be. But he has very high negative ratings among the electorate generally and among specific portions of the electorate. Very negative with young people, college-educated people in the United States, women, and Hispanics. And he's running a campaign really focused at this point on trying to maximize the white voter turnout and electorate in the United States. And I think that's a hard task given that the country is just moving in a different direction demographically. But that I think is the strategy he has to undertake given his numbers, unless he's going to shift strategy totally and try to broaden his appeal to these groups, which, by the way, is what the Republican Party said it was going to do after the last election. He went in a different direction. So then the question is, why Trump? Where did this phenomenon come from? There's not a single political pundit in the United States who predicted Donald Trump was going to be the nominee of the Republican Party a year ago. And yet here we are, and he is the nominee of the Republican Party. I think it reflects a number of things. One is a deep economic anxiety among certain cohorts of the American population. Those who have been hurt by the recession didn't really recover from it. Globalization makes their outlook even less likely. If you are, there's a lot of economic analysis on this. If you are out of work for a year and a half or 2 years and you're the breadwinner in a family, it's incredibly corrosive. It's psychologically difficult. Family structures fall apart. Your kids do worse than you did. It's a incredible pressure on people, and I think that's felt by a significant part of the American population. You feel it in other populations around the country. The result of globalization, technological advancement, and the result of the recession, being left behind. Second, I think just as importantly, is cultural anxiety. Same group feel like the country has just changed at a velocity that's incredible, right? It's not the same country, they say. That it's not the same country. We were talking about the statistics earlier. And there's, Trump's statement is, make America great again. The again part is the most important part of that slogan. To bring back America to some other state in the mind's eye of a number of people is the way it used to be. And of course, that's a false promise, right? But nonetheless, I think that's really what he's going through. It's economic anxiety, it's cultural anxiety, it's having to deal with really high velocity change, and he's a strong man who can bring that back. That's the promise that he's making. I think that's what's going on here, and it's combined with this strong anti-immigration push that he's put forward. That really is it's economic anxiety, cultural change, political correctness, he would call it, and looking at immigration as being a cause of some of the difficulties that people have had. This is especially powerful for white, non-college educated voters in the United States, the men in particular, and that's the core of the Trump support going forward. I said it was consequential, and by the way, we see this in a number of Western democracies, which we can talk about as a result of the difficulty of governing post-recession and in a time of globalization. Impact, and then I'll finish, we can take questions. Hillary Clinton would represent, if she were elected, a substantial amount of continuity. She's a well-known figure. Her advisors are well-known, both on the foreign and domestic side. She has a track record. She's put forth what presidential candidates typically do. She's put forth very detailed proposals. She leans a little more to the right on foreign policy than President Obama, and a little more to the left during the course of this campaign on some policies. So, as I said, it's continuity, but there would be some change. I think bank regulation would be more intense. She's made a number of statements and promises during the course of the campaign about a risk tax on those banking entities that have, financial entities that have more than $50 billion in assets. I think you would see The so-called shadow banking industry set up for regulation under President Clinton. She has said that she would more aggressively regulate fracking, and you also could see energy changes, and trade. In the United States right now, there is a really serious anti-trade mood. That may be the case in Europe as well, but Secretary Clinton is now against the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is the biggest trade negotiation in the world. So I think, and pharmaceutical pricing, I think, would also be a target going forward here in a Democratic administration. On the other side, I think you see a big push for infrastructure investment. I think you see business tax reform, but nonetheless, general continuity, but specific sectors, I think, would have an impact. Trump would be a disruptive election. He's taken positions which are outside the positions taken by the Republican Party, typically. The Republican Party is typically a free trade party, right? He has taken foreign policy positions which are inconsistent with the positions taken by every president, Democrat and Republican, since World War II. So you go through it. Trade, he's for renegotiating most of our trade agreements. He's for building a wall with Mexico. He's for adding 45% tariffs on trade with China. There's just an out-and-out hostility to trade. Relations with our neighbors, Mexico, again, he said he wants to build a wall between the United States and Mexico. He said he would undo the Iran deal. He said he would undo the Paris Accords. On immigration, his plan is to round up 11 million undocumented immigrants in the United States and ship them back to Mexico. His tax plan is a $10 trillion plan, at least on paper. He would roll back the health care reforms. So there would be, I think it's just fair to say analytically, a high degree of uncertainty with a Trump candidacy. The other thing that makes it very hard to predict, and I'll finish up on this, is this. I said earlier that Clinton has advisors, that are well known. Trump doesn't have any advisors. So people compare Trump to Ronald Reagan. That comparison is way off. I know a lot about the Reagan campaign, right? I got thrown out of my first job by Ronald Reagan, right, when he beat us in the 1980 election. I was 24 years old and on the street as a result of Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan led an intellectual, ideological movement. It was deeply rooted in policy. He had been governor of California twice. He had run for president. 1980 was the third time he had run for president. He almost got nominated in 1976 against President Ford. He had spoken on these issues for 30 years, right? And had, last point I'll make, he had a very well-known group of advisors, from George Shultz to Cap Weinberger, right? To Jim Baker. It was just an entirely different scene. So, and you knew then what he was bringing. I say this a lot. I give lectures on transitions in government, and I say this a lot, that in the 1980 transition, everybody knew when they went to an agency after Reagan got elected what they were supposed to do, because it was clear. That's not the case. This makes predicting Trump very difficult. He doesn't have any advisors. So general continuity versus high degree of disruption. And a very consequential election. And you all have been very, very patient listening to me say I really appreciate it. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much so far, Mr. Donilon.
Yeah.
Any questions? So maybe let me start with a question. You talked about the Middle East,
yeah.
Russia, China, Brexit, and the election at the end. And my first question is about the election. If Donald Trump gets elected, is there a way that, for example, the Parliament in the United States or the courts can handle his ideas, or do you think he would have to change those institutions as well?
Well, I'd say a number of things about that. First of all, we don't elect dictators in the United States. We elect presidents, and there are checks and balances, and there are constraints. That's the first point. And obviously, you have the legal constraints of the courts. If you want to do fundamental change, you have to get it through the legislature, through the American Congress. That's the first point. The second point, though, is this. That said, American presidents have a lot of power. And they can move policy. For example, President Obama, in the last couple of years, given the difficulty of moving legislation, right, has put in place the following things through executive action, right? Most of the things that we're doing to meet our COP21 climate change Paris commitments, he's done through executive action. A number of the things on immigration that he's implemented, he's done through executive action. The Iran deal is essentially an executive agreement, right? And when something has been done through executive action, it can be undone by the next executive. So I think that, yes, there are constraints, no doubt about that, but there's also a lot of authority in the executive branch, and he would be able to implement a number of the things, I think, not all of them, but a number of the things that he could undo a lot of the things that have been put in place. There's also been some, you see, he's confronted, really been confrontational with the judiciary. It would be a different kind of presidency. The third thing I would say, I would tell you this, there are, having worked pretty closely with 3 presidents over the course of 35 years, there are the things that a president does every single day that make a difference, right? These decisions that come in, right? So you give examples, right? On the foreign policy side, which is the side I know the best. Are we going to take this strike or not? Are we going to go after bin Laden through a raid with special forces, or are we going to drop a large bomb on the compound? All right. Why aren't we going to drop a large bomb on the compound? It's easier. Well, because we would then have collateral damage. We would kill 50 innocent people, right? These decisions that a president has to make. I sat there. So the night that I watched Obama, and the bin Laden raid may be the best example of this, right? That I spent 8 months working with the president on this, right? Where he went through every single aspect of this. Is the intelligence right? What are going to be the collateral consequences? What makes sense? Is it too risky to send our guys in, right? Is that better than just leveling the place? If we level the place, what do we get? We get a propaganda war and we kill 50 innocent people. All right, what's the trade-off? So those are the kinds of things, the kinds of decisions a president has to make every day that I think would be new, obviously, to Mr. Trump. Okay. And make a big difference.
All right, we have the first question in the audience.
Mr. Donilon, looking at the development in the Arabian states, in particular Iraq, Egypt, and the Arabian Spring, as well as the stability of Saudi Arabia. And even though we in the Western world are usually very enthusiastic in bringing democracy all over the world, would you share the view that a stable autocracy or even dictatorship in these Arabian states is preferable over this confusion right now?
Yeah, I think that's a core question. It's a really good question. I think that stability is pretty important, obviously, and you always have to look what the alternative is going to be to the regime that you have in place. I think that gradual, evolving responsiveness to people, right, is important as well to maintain stability. The kinds of radical changes we saw in the wake of the Arab Spring did not bring stability, right? You had these strongman governments swept aside without any of the kind of institutional or preparatory or kind of societal preparation to take on a democracy. And you also had really serious opponents of democracy and violent outfits like ISIS and other outfits. So I wouldn't say it as a kind of as a black and white general matter. I do think though that stability is important, that countries have to evolve in their own way, that evolving towards being responsible governors of people ultimately will bring you stability. But forcing these issues and doing away with the establishments of the state before there's something ready to replace them doesn't appear to have been a good idea. And I think, frankly, that in the Arab world today, it's hard to think that the Arab revolutions have brought us anything positive at this point. That the regimes that, what's replaced them has been chaos, right? And as I said earlier, kind of ungoverned space, which has allowed this vacuum for these groups to come up, right? So when you talk, listen, would we like to see more reform in Saudi Arabia? Of course. And I think the new regime, I think, is moving towards reform there. But you also have to think very carefully about what the enemies of your interests are, with some clarity, and the pace at which countries can go, also very clearly have in mind what's the alternative to this, because the alternative is not something that you can just kind of make up, right? And have it be perfect. So I think that's a really good question, and we do need to bring some more stability to these states before we can go forward. There's going to be some sort of state authority put in place in these places. Thank you for your question.
I have two
Next
questions. So one is, what do you think are the probabilities that TTIP is going to happen, and what's missing at the moment, or what else does it take? And do you have a view on who the vice president is going to be under Clinton, or who she's going to appoint?
Yeah, on TTIP, you know, I certainly hope so. That I'll say a couple of things about trade. Right? One is it's become unpopular in the United States in the campaign. Two, we have a Pacific agreement that's been negotiated among 12 countries that involves 40% of the world's GDP that's sitting to be approved, and it's been stalled. My own judgment is, in order for that to get done, it'll have to get done at the very end of this Congress before President Obama leaves. And I think there's some chance that could happen. On TTIP, what I would love to see is to have the treaty negotiated by the time President Obama leaves, so it would be ready for review by the Congress. That's going to take, you asked what's required, your next question, right? That's going to take a lot of leadership in Europe, frankly. And I don't know why the enthusiasm or intensity around this seems to have backed off a little bit, because in an economic zone that's looking for economic growth potential, this isn't on the shelf, right? Just waiting, I think, to be done. So I think it's possible, but I don't know a way to predict at this point. And I think what's required is a really concerted effort by European leaders to try to get at least the outlines of this deal done by the time President Obama leaves. Because here's the problem. When he leaves, trade's not going to be the first priority of anybody who's going to replace him at this point. There's a lot of other things to do in the world, right? And particularly a focus on the U.S. economy. So I don't have any, in the second question, I don't have any way to predict who the next vice president's going to be. And the reason for that is because the presidential candidates don't know. So it's kind of hard to predict it. I think there's a lot of good candidates on the Democratic side. And there have been a number of people on the Republican side. It's interesting. You've had a number of people on the Republican side kind of say they would step forward and work with Mr. Trump, I think, in order to try to bring some government experience to his team.
Yeah. Next question is over there.
Yeah, hi, good afternoon.
Hello. Looking further ahead, to what extent do you think investors and government should be concerned about the world supply of food and water becoming potential causes of tension and conflict?
Yeah, I think pretty high, particularly in light of climate change, which is going to bring all manner of changes to those systems of food and water. So I think in light of climate change, it absolutely can be a source of conflict. It should be something that we look very, very carefully at. It's interesting on food and water also. I think if I had Chinese colleagues here with me today, they would also comment about that being kind of a fundamental obligation. Now I'm talking about safety issues inside a country, a fundamental obligation of a state. I think they see this now in China, for example, food, water pollution, drug spoliation as being really serious issues about government performance. And one of the reasons, by the way, this kind of capital outflow to buy the stuff to bring in, it's a complicated issue. But I agree with you. If you think, if we could sit here and do, it's interesting. Some of the biggest advocates in the U.S. government today for addressing climate change and for implementing the things that the president said that he would do to meet our Paris obligations are the Joint Chiefs. It's our military guys. It's interesting, who think this way, right? I mean, they look at the map and they say, all right, what are the potential conflicts we could have in the world, right? And what could cause those conflicts? And those guys, right, and women, right, are really the principal advocates in the government, right, for addressing climate change. It's really interesting. They're the first people to raise their hand and say, we want to testify on this, right? When you're doing stuff. It goes to your question.
Mr. Van der Laan, all the way in the back.
Yeah. Hi.
Hi. Two questions. One, if the Secretary would ask you, since you've been speculating about the vice presidential nomination, one, if she were to ask you if you'd serve, would you be game? And the second question, on a more serious note, is you've been doing debate prep for every president so far. Having listened to Secretary Clinton's speech last week on foreign policy, which I think was only in part a speech on foreign policy, do you think that's the right attack line for her, and is that message going to stick?
Yeah. No, on the second question first, the speech that Secretary Clinton gave last week was essentially a critique of Mr. Trump's foreign policy positions. What that speech was about, that's a really interesting question. What that speech was, that wasn't about, it was about the policies, it was about some of the things that he said that aren't right in her judgment, right? And things that she thinks are inconsistent with the U.S. tradition. But what that's all on the surface. What that speech is really about is the presidential choice. That was the argument that was being made here, right? You know, it's interesting. You ask about the debate. So, in American politics, particularly when you're a newcomer, and you know, I went through this on the defeat when I got defeated with Reagan was able to do this, right? And was on the positive side when Obama was able to do this. People have to be able to close their eyes at some point when there's somebody new, and they have to imagine that person in the Oval Office. And if they can't do it, and you're new, and they don't know enough about you, you're not going to get the presidency, you know? So in 1980, we ran a very tough campaign against Ronald Reagan. We said he was a B-movie actor, that he was going to get us in a war with the Soviet Union, the whole thing, right, you know? And because people wanted to move away from President Carter. Very low approval ratings, but it stuck, and it stuck all the way through the campaign until the debate. We had one debate in 1980 where Reagan came on, and the American people looked at him and said, he doesn't look that scary to us, right? And we can imagine him as president. He won the election that night. He went from basically a tie, he blew it out by 10 points, right, in the last week of the campaign because of that exact point. Same thing happened in 2008. So you have Barack Obama, a fairly unknown senator, right, you know, African-American guy, you know, running for president of the United States, and against John McCain, a war hero, and one of the great experts in our country on national security and foreign affairs, and a wonderful American person, right, you know. And the first debate was on foreign policy, and our plan was that if you could, on the presidential choice point, right, they wanted to move away from President Bush and the Republicans after the Iraq War and after the recession, right? The recession was coming on, economic stuff. And the plan was if we could have the first debate on national security, and if people could come away and say, you know what, this guy can handle it. And that's what happened. He won that first debate. Obama won that first debate on national security, and that was when he won the election. So what that speech was about, yes, it's about the policy positions, it's about all this other stuff, right? It's really about the presidential choice. It's really about asking people, and it was clever, it was asking people asking people to try to imagine this person in the Oval Office. That's critical. On your first question, every person at my level and experience who says that they're not interested in going back in the government is not telling the truth. That's, of course. You know, it's an honor to be in the government. And it's of course, I think I'd love to serve. My wife is in the government still. My wife is the U.S. Ambassador at Large, Kathy Russell, for women's issues, so we have kind of a long-term commitment. I'll tell one story about this. So when I went in 2008, he was like maybe, how old is he now? He was like 8 years old, my son, my youngest child. And he said, Dad, I said, yes. He said, I hear that you and Mom are going to go in the government. I said, well, you know, we worked in Senator Obama's campaign, and we committed to public service. We may do this. He looked at me, looked up, he said, I hear that if you work in the government, you work more hours and you make less money. I said, well, that's true. That's what public service is all about. And he looked at me as only an 8-year-old can do and said, what's the matter with you?
There's another question.
Could you elaborate a little bit on the phenomenon of Bernie Sanders and in combination? So the European view is central left a little bit maybe, and the US view might be more left wing, very populistic. Yeah. And in combination, do you consider the social issue will emerge in the US? We heard about GDP development, but 90% have no real income increase over the 2 decades.
Yeah, this is important. Obviously, and Senator Sanders, again, was not predicted to have the kind of staying power that he's had. And I think it's because he's gone to this issue of economic anxiety. Not necessarily the kind of, the combination of economic and cultural anxiety I was talking about with Donald Trump, although some of that, but really kind of the plight of the middle class in the United States, of stagnant wages, of the things that used to be part of a middle class life costing more and more money, like a college education in the United States, which the cost of which has gone up far greater than the cost of inflation. Pensions, the ability to have the ability to retire, which is now being extended, particularly after the recession, and people in this room know, and the huge difficulty in getting returns, right, that can allow you to retire. So I think Sanders really hit a chord, frankly, in the United States. And I think, frankly, that you see him and Secretary Clinton actually agreeing on a number of these things. A minimum wage, right? Some of these things that were really not on the agenda in a big way before this campaign. Right now, the $15 an hour minimum wage campaign is almost standard now in a lot of the cities around the United States. I think you saw President Obama, actually, it's kind of a detail, but it's really important. Just last week, President Obama say that he was for actually increasing Social Security benefits in the United States, which is our core pension fund, right, public pension fund. The debate in the United States had been for years about how to get people to retire later, reduce the benefits, tax it for wealthier people. And he came out and said basically that he could see being for actually increasing the benefits. I think that's all been. I think Sanders has pushed those issues, and I think he's done it well, frankly, and it's had an impact on the debate. His campaign, though, it's interesting. It's a broader campaign. It's not as it doesn't have the same kind of edge and only aimed kind of at a certain voter that the Trump campaign. The Trump campaign is a different style of campaign. The Sanders campaign is about middle-class anxiety, and I think has had an impact. And as I said in my little list of stuff that I think Clinton will do, I think he's had an impact on the agenda for the next president.
There's one last question over there.
Yes. Hi, good afternoon.
I would like to come back to what you said earlier about terrorism and the IS, and that some of the progress that was been made to the IS forced them to push out, and that Paris and Brussels were in connection with that. I'd like to offer an alternative explanation and ask your opinion on that. And that is that what we see in Paris and Brussels is entirely homemade, that the IS does not actually care about Western Europe, and that these are just people with kind of failed integration of migrants into Europe that caused them to remain poor and uneducated with no prospects for the future, looking for a way out or something to do that draws attention to them, and that the IS is just a convenient money giver to these types of people, but that any of these attacks are not orchestrated or initiated by the IS.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very, very important point. So let's try to push it through. First of all, there's no doubt that the roots of the problem in Europe are in these neighborhoods and the inability of these families to integrate in a fulfilling way into European society. I think that's a given. Second, though, I don't think there's any doubt that they have been inspired by and pushed by the ISIS propaganda and its effort. ISIS is exceedingly competent technologically through websites and communicating with people, trying to inspire them to action around the world. Al-Qaeda was an entirely different organization. Al-Qaeda would take years to plan its actions. You know, the 9/11 attacks really began probably 3 years beforehand in Afghanistan with this guy Khalid Sheikh Mohammed working with Osama bin Laden. But the ISIS operation is kind of much more indiscriminate, and it's trying to inspire people and to set up these various organizations around the world. Next, I think it gives these folks a place to go and get organized, right, and to have a bigger cause, right, other than just their own alienation. And so I think it's both. I think it's a combination of both. And I think the ISIS crowd, right, is doing something else here. They are in a competition with Al-Qaeda and these other groups to be seen as the leading global jihadist group. The way they have to do this is they have to continue to have a narrative of success. They had a tremendous narrative of success, they thought, in Iraq and Syria when they were able to come through Blitzkrieg in 2014, take over a large piece of Iraq and also parts of Syria as well, with very effective military action, right? But now that's been pushed back. In order for them to continue to get the money, in order for them to continue to be seen as a leading jihadist group in the world, they have to have successes. And I think that they then will live off incidents like the Brussels and Paris events. So it's symbiotic. I don't know, you wouldn't have one without the other, although I don't think you can underestimate the impact that the organization ISIS has on inspiring these folks. And indeed, as I said, most of the Paris, I think 7 out of the 8, had been in Syria. And this is kind of a training ground and a place where they can go and become more committed to the cause and then get directed out. I think ISIS is a real threat. I do, and they will take advantage of these situations where you have groups of people who have been unassimilated. Now, the truth is, of course, is that this wasn't like the Al Qaeda attacks in the United States, for example, right? The attackers in Paris and Brussels were Europeans. They were born in Europe. So there's that piece of it, but I think that this aggressive external agenda by ISIS also, I think, is a necessary part of it. And I think if we don't deal with it, they will continue to try to take advantage of these situations, number one. And number two, they will continue to try to have the 5,000 or so ISIS foreign fighters with Western passports come back into these communities, again, to try to draw attention to ISIS and say, we may be getting beat on the ground in Fallujah or in Raqqa or in Mosul, but we have a global effort underway that shows that we're still the preeminent force fighting against the West.
All right.
It's my view, but it's a fair point.
Thank you very much, Mr. Donilon.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.